All right, I wanted to do a quick review of async lesson number 8. So just hit on a couple of the points for you guys. So one of the big points of this lesson was about Bacon's rebellion, and this was a large-scale rebellion. It was led by Nathaniel Bacon. Kind of strange name, but that's what it was. Maybe it'll help you remember it. So Bacon himself was a lower level planter. Remember, even though sometimes we think of all these plantation owners as being really wealthy and rich, we need to remember that even going back to the earliest days of America, there were many very poor white farmers. Okay? And so just to keep that in mind, now, he championed the cause of the frontier farmers, and many of those people on the frontier had been indentured servants at one time. So, indentured servant again signs a contract, gets their passage to the New World paid for, and then they work. Usually, it was about 7 years, but contracts varied. And then after that, they were supposed to be free men. And that was, the case. Many of these people had been indentured servants at one time, moved out into the frontier. And so Nathaniel Bacon kind of rallied them all up to fight back. He led his cause or his group to Jamestown, and they burned down a bunch of homes. One thing this is important about is that it is supposed to be is seen as a turning point, because now what's going to happen is the elite planters are no longer going to want to use white people as indentured servants or as basically like slave labor. They want to instead turn to a system where they could add a racial hierarchy and as a way of suppressing these kinds of rebellions from happening. So Bacon's rebellion, you do need to know this one for sure. It was indentured servant rebellion. All right. The middle passage, of course, is going to be how African Americans are brought. I'm trying to move this little guy here. So brought to the New World. I covered this a little bit in an earlier lesson, but I just thought this picture was really telling. And so the slave trade included Africans from various cultural and linguistic groups, which is really important because they can't communicate in many cases amongst themselves. And if you can't communicate, then it's very hard to bind together and try to rebel. But the situation on the middle passage is, some of the worst we've ever seen in history. Kind of conditions. They were, in fact, kept in almost like coffin-like structures like this. Very few meals. You would think they would try to, take better care of these people that they were going to eventually sell, right, as like a piece of property, essentially. But they didn't, and in part they didn't. They tried to keep them weak on purpose so that they wouldn't fight back. So even though they were chained and locked in these dank quarters, it was just an awful, awful, awful experience. Now, just another thing about slavery in the British colonies is this racial hierarchy, which is what those elite planners in Virginia were actually kind of hoping for as a way of suppressing future rebellion. So this idea of like rules about slaves, it hardened in Virginia, meaning it just got stricter and stricter. We're going to have all kinds of codes. We're going to have slave codes, and we're going to have Jim Crow. We're going to have all these codes as a means of keeping enslaved Africans and then African Americans from rebelling and fighting back. Here's a picture of John Castor. You read about him in the reading, and the courts did determine he could not be considered an indentured servant, that he was, in fact, a slave for life, so he could not be free. So there's a sketch of him. All right, and then this is a really important thing, too. I just copied and pasted this from the reading, but this Latin phrase, partus sequitur ventrum, is a phrase that means you are a slave for life, and this also passes down your status from the mother to the child. And this is really important, you guys, because previously it was father to child, but that didn't work in this culture where, hey, the white plantation owners, instead of having to purchase somebody who had been brought from Africa, could just rape a woman, an enslaved woman, and then the subsequent child, even though it was his child, would now become a slave. And so I think this is a really hard thing to wrap our minds around it. Like, how could somebody do that to their own child? But they believed in this principle, and it really didn't matter. So this is going to lead to an escalation of rape and sexual violence against the women, the African women, eventual African American women, but depending on generation, but it's gonna have a huge impact, and especially when the slave trade itself is abolished, we're gonna just see that escalate like crazy. So it's very important to know that this slave culture was an extremely violent culture, and enslaved women, were not free from that violence against them, potential violence against them, at all times. At all times, this was very, traumatic way of trying to live and survive. All right. So I want to also just kind of keep in mind that resistance, there's two types of resistance, overt and covert. So overt is like where you see the actual rebellions or fighting back, or like, attacks on a slave owner or something like that, burning down their building, something that's overt. And then covert is kind of like behind the scenes kind of stuff. Slave owners actually did live in fear that their slaves would, attack them or kill them. Martha Washington really famously was very scared about her slaves, attacking her in the middle of the night and killing her, right? So not that you can feel bad for them if you want. You can have whatever feelings, but, they are holding people as property. So I guess that's the consequence, right? These types of rebellions were pretty uncommon just because, again, of the fear factor. And we'll get more into that a little bit later. The idea of separating families, selling children, all those kinds of tactics the slave owners would use to keep their slaves in line. The most famous slave rebellion, again, this came up earlier as well, was the Stono Rebellion. So Pickens is an indentured servant, Stono is slave. And we've got 20 slaves. They're, getting some weapons, attacking us, or they killed 20 slave owners. So this is a pretty big deal. But the rebellion was put down very quickly, and they made a big deal about it. But this is a little mile marker right here that you can see that stands today to kind of honor that rebellion. All right. And then other forms of rebellion, of course, existed. These would be the covert types, and they could be from working slowly, breaking tools, retaining cultural connections to Africa, trying to retain their names. They often were given English names, and their religion, different things like that. This image here is a sketch of somebody running away, so that's another form of resistance. All of these things were, very difficult, but I think it is important to recognize that they resisted in the manner that they could, and they were able to. It might not seem like such a big deal to us, but we have to remember the environment that they are living in and what they are able to do and what the circumstances around them are. Especially the slaves who had children, it was a very, very, very difficult situation for them because of the separation of families, the violence against children, from their mothers and their fathers, and just, all these horrible, horrible conditions. So, okay, so that's just kind of the main points of Async Lesson 8. I just wanted to review with you guys. So, thanks so much. Hopefully that helped a little bit.